Thanks for that, Brian. That's quite a tough act to follow with you and Lyle. So thanks for calling out the actually incorrect acronym. The reason it's not Network Functions Virtualization, which I've been actually pushing, and with an English spelling, by the way, because you can tell by the accent I'm not from around here, is that actually I pulled out the minutes of the original meeting that we had in Paris in June 2012, and I was shocked to find that actually Peter Willis coined the term network function virtualization, and then I looked up the acronym and found it didn't mean anything rude. So we said, that's it. It's NFV. And then we left that meeting, and all of us are now working really hard to make that a reality. And particularly, I'd like to acknowledge Brian personally, because there was a meeting I remember back in Plano, Texas, with Intel and HP, Wind River, VeryView, now part of Akamai, where Brian showed me a diagram that helped me understand that this thing was actually possible to do with Intel architecture, which was to virtualize network functions. So as an architect within Intel, Brian's role in being influential is untold until today. One thing, so this is actually taking a completely superficial track, right? There's going to be nothing in here that is intellectually challenging, which is about right for almost the last presentation. I think one after me, Glenn, right? So I'm not really between you and the tea break. But having been now on this journey of NFV since early part of 2011, where are we? And I was quite heartened by a number of comments today from different people that we aren't indeed in the Gartner trough of disillusionment, that we actually may be climbing out the other side. And that's my assessment too, right? Because actually what's going on in the industry is there are pockets of NFV deployment, or at least virtualized infrastructure deployments for different use cases, SD-WAN being one, virtual CPE being another. So we are seeing the fruits of all of the labor that we've put in over the past 4 to 5 years. And what I mean by we is a very complex and active ecosystem with a bunch of standards development organizations, which if you're a telco R&D person, you think of the word standards and your heart sinks because you know that in our industry, standards are both a boon and a weight to get done. But in our industry, we can't, as the real conclusion of my talk is about, is we can't actually ignore or decouple from standards. We have industry forums, and what industry forums do, they're a very useful place for the users of technology or future technology proposition to get together and decide what they want from that technology, and then to work collectively to push the ecosystem in that direction. I've just called out 2, but there are any number of these industry forums. Recognizing that in all of this, the vendors need to make money and sell solutions to operators that are useful to us to deploy. So that's the bit that I call implementation. So specification, requirements, implementation, and then of course we have hopefully deployment to justify all of that R&D and product development that we've all been doing. And academia. So a lot of people talk about academia, but as a graduate of a university in the UK in computer systems, way back in 1978, who was at university in 1978 or thereabouts? All too young, right? Your dad was there. I was studying computer systems in 1978, just as computational linguistics hit the computer science domain. And a bunch of linguists said, you know, linguistics is very similar to parsing computer code. Why don't we marry these disciplines together? And so computational linguistics became a module within my university degree. But I didn't actually get on with it. I didn't understand what it was about. And the other thing that was really cool in those days was this thing called AI, right? Who remembers the wave of AI going back to 1978 to onwards, right? Yep, we all remember what happened to that. It basically ran out of computer code performance, and it ran out of storage and a whole bunch of things which killed it pretty quickly. But nowadays we've got really a resurgence of what I prefer to call machine learning. Because what is intelligence anyway? But that's a conversation for another day. And then this thing called open source. And I've got a bunch of things on there. I just updated it with ONAP, of course, because that's the big thing. And I had to take off OpenO and put ONAP on there to show that. Now, what does that tell you? That tells you to move forward in this industry, there are a lot of players and a lot of stakeholders. So there's no chance that any single organization or group can orchestrate all of that. It happens by itself. So if anybody's going to tell you that that player or that player or that community is the key to progress is completely wrong. This will happen by serendipity, by conversations that you have at this conference in the coffee break. You'll take something away and make something happen. But what I've been doing for the last 4 years still, I'm really quite surprised I'm still here, is pushing along in ETSI NFV, and I chair the Network Operator Council, which is, I think, currently about 37 global telcos. And there's a picture of my colleague from Deutsche Telekom, Uwe Michel, who's still beavering away inside Deutsche Telekom, production engineering NFV for DT. But we founded it, actually, under a legal umbrella that we all were signed up to already from an IPR point of view to collaborate. I was then at BT. So we couldn't have corridor conversations amongst operators for very long before people would start to worry that we were colluding on something. So we had to bring these discussions under an umbrella, and we chose ETSI. And we chose ETSI because it had this interesting forum idea called an industry specification group, which required that you didn't have to pay a fee to join it. All you had to do was sign up to a fairly standard FRAND, fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory terms IPR agreement. And that meant we can get the small, independent software vendors working with us. Normally, they wouldn't go anywhere near ETSI. It's a standards body. Why would we go there? Have to pay a lot of money, and then we get nothing back. So we founded a body which was intended to bring the small players to work with the larger players and the likes of Intel and ARM and the others to converge requirements and then to work collectively to push this idea called NFV forward. Now, of course, 4 years on, maybe 5 years on, depending on when we determine it started, we're seeing it all happen. And that's really quite refreshing, because I really worried, and in the early days, I did some interviews with Telecom TV and a few others where I said, we expect to sunset the forum in 2 years. Because by then, the operators would have converged requirements, they would have persuaded the vendors that they needed to work together to make products and standards. We can walk away and let it all happen. Well, 80,000 man-hours of meetings later, 290 companies, 37 operators, we're still beavering away. But we have released a lot of useful information, which has been called out in a number of places. The ETSI NFV architectural framework is the basis, despite some people not agreeing to it, for all of that innovation right now. It's a framework on which much of this is hanging on. But there's an observation that I think is really the tenor of my talk today, which is about the difference in the cultures between the cloud industry and the telco industry. This has been apparent from the very beginning, which is that people who design networks at scale with the disciplines of operations and regulation are different skill sets and different mindsets to people that write software day by day. And I've done both, written a lot of code in my life, in my early days, not so much recently, and I've run innovation teams and R&D teams whose output will be scale deployment of technology. I did most of my R&D in Access. But when I look inside the realm of cloud, I see players who live and breathe software day and night, literally. And they're masters, I would say they're masters of that universe. And those of you that were in the Google talk this morning, Vinoy, was a great thing. He's already thinking about Cloud 3.0, where everything is disaggregated. And yet, aren't we in telco still talking about servers and these discrete boxes? It's almost like they're 2 generations ahead of us. But one of the things that struck me about what he said, I don't know whether you caught it, was that he said that they work with about 12 vendors, of which the largest vendor is Google itself. But he didn't say how much larger, but I would contend significantly larger than any of the other players that play in that space. What does that tell you? To be master of the universe in which you play, you have to be your own vendor. Not just for the software stack, potentially for the hardware that goes with it. And that's the focus for the R&D that we're doing at CableLabs, which is not the subject of this particular talk. But the question then arises, if we in the network space are used to working on standards, and those guys are used to working on code, how do these 2 things play out? And I'm not really here to give you an answer. I'm actually here to ask you to ponder and perhaps to resist some of the messaging that you may hear from certain parts of the industry that standards are no longer relevant. It's not true, and that's really the basis for my talk. But it's very subjective, okay? So this is my opinion, and I'm not being critical of any particular approach, and I'm not meaning to advocate for a particular approach. I'm actually going to finish up by saying that we need to work together and find a hybrid way. So just to let you know that I'm not on a track to deprecate open source or standards. I think that, but I will call out a few of the pros and cons, and some of you may see cons as an advantage. Particularly if you're a software guy, you'd see that as great. That's a con. I think that's our attribute, right? We're disruptive. You can't control us. We're democratic. We're meritocratic. First thing I think I'd say about open source is the low barrier participation. You can literally sign up to an open source community today and develop code and contribute it. In the standards domain, you generally have to sign up to an IPR agreement. So right there, you have a barrier to entry. However, on the pro side of open source, the community develops the code collaboratively. And isn't that great? And so I think that's really the most powerful attribute of the open source community. It's community development. But standards do community development too. In the standards domain, they share learning and rationale. Throughout my career, where I've had to endure standards meetings, and you do endure them. In fact, a guy from Red Hat once said to me over a beer, the worst 2 hours I ever spent was in an ETSI NFV meeting. And he deliberately did that to annoy me. It didn't annoy me, I actually sympathized with him. Because at the end of the day, if you're not there to participate in that process, you should not be there. Any more than the pain that I've been going through on an internet relay chat project meeting of OPNFV. So I'm watching the IRC lines, I'm going, +1, agree, not agree. I'm going, really? Where's the code? So, you know, it's about culture, it's about the way that they do things. It doesn't mean to say that it's wrong, it's just that that's the way that they do things. You've probably read all of that already. The cons, culture resistant to change. I think that's true of all of us, isn't it? The longer you've been around, you think you know the right way, but then I try and keep my mind open. I think the key ones on the cons for standards that I'm worrying about, it's aligning the domain-specific standards. Remember what NFV is. We stand up an NFV infrastructure, then the whole point is we onboard functions or elements of functions that call out standards. And it doesn't matter whether you're Google or BT or CableLabs. Those standards like IP and Ethernet, those are standards. And you have to deploy things in a way that's interoperable. So how are you going to onboard a function coming from the Broadband Forum versus a function coming from 3GPP versus a function coming from MEF? if there's not some sort of alignment, and I think, Brian, you called out data models, or was it Lyle? One of you called out data models, and that is actually where in CableLabs we're focusing much of our effort now, is can we release to the community the data models that relate to the cable industry, because that would help the development of virtual functions for us. Then the other thing I'd like to call out is the authority. And this is the bit where the telco culture meets the IT culture. So open source doesn't like authority, right? Absolutely. Who's an open source guy here? Or gal? None of you. Oh, that's a shame. So of course, authority is a bad word, right? That means control. That means top-down programming. They don't like that. On the other hand, in the telecom space, if you are about to plan or you've got a vision for a roadmap which implies $1 billion of investment and the timescale for delivery, where you've got your customers waiting for that function, you've sold it, and you need to deploy it, and you need to deploy it at scale, and thanks for talking about service assurance, Brian, and you need to then assure it, the open source community says, well, we've not yet agreed what's going to be in release X. We're waiting for the committers and the project leaders to tell us, so I can't then decide what the feature set is for the thing that I'm going to spend $1 billion on. That's a problem, right? That's not to say it's a showstopper and that open source is no good. It just means there's a mismatch between open source and production in the telecom space. If you're Google, you control your world. Inside your world, you control all of it. The applications, the hardware, the software. You can decide on the timescales and you write the code and you deploy. So there's a big difference for our industry. But that's not to say people like me don't like open source. In fact, I was one of the initiators of OPNFV, and the reason that we initiated Open Platform for NFV, it's an integration project, was to actually test open source, to say, okay guys, I'm now trapped. Unfortunately, as I said, we didn't sunset the forum in 2 years. I became trapped in a standards environment, and I couldn't just stop doing it because I was part of the leadership to push it forward and to try and get it speeding up. But we wanted to see how open source would play. How would OpenStack interoperate with Open Daylight, with Open vSwitch, and can DPDK be applied, and can we get the performance? Well, let's stand up a community which has become highly successful. OPNFV is a highly successful community, and I congratulate all of the people in OPNFV, Heather Kirksey, Chris Price, my colleague in CableLabs, Tetsuya Nakamura, in fact, who just walked in, hi Tetsuya. So all of those guys have done a great job, and they are releasing code, releasing a validated platform where all of us are effectively debugging the stack. It's no longer a open source component, it's the whole stack. And that's been incredibly useful. And then there's the feedback loop to ETSI via the companies that participate to show us how our specs need to be modified. And then I will call out open source manner. I think we've talked about fragmentation. BT, CableLabs, Verizon, Telefonica, all part of open source Mano. It's an interesting community. First of all, it's actually convened under ETSI as an industry specification kind of group, so you do need to sign something, but there's still no money that's transacted. But what I like about open source Mano is its simplicity and its focus. It is actually validating the ETSI NFV framework with code applied and APIs applied in the right places. And it has a network service orchestrator, which is not in scope of ETSI NFV. And already, within 18 months, 100 issues have been fed back into the ETSI NFV specs, effectively validating and helping us in ETSI NFV evolve the specifications. We've got our drafts all open so that we can have the open source communities getting drafts, they can see where the directions are going, and that's the bit that we've done to speed up the spec process and map it to the open source requirements. And then really, I think that just recognizing that there's always going to be a cultural difference, but that doesn't mean to say that we can't work together and live together and work harmoniously together. There just needs to be that we need to recognize the value that each brings and figure out how better to work together. So that sounds like a kind of motherhood and apple pie kind of let's all be friends statement, But what I want you to go away with is when people tell you that standards are obsolete, it's not true in the telecoms industry, and don't let that influence you. And that's important because if your company believes that to be true, then the people that you've got working in standards are going to be pulled out. And that will be damaging to industry progress. So that's the reason that I'm telling you that standards are important, so that you don't go and do the wrong thing. And my time just ran out, and I'd like to hand over to the next speaker, so thank you very much.